言論アリーナ、今日はスペシャル版として、デンマークのクライメットリアリストである、ビョルン・ロンボルグさんをお迎えしました。それから右にいらっしゃるのはおなじみの有馬淳さんです。よろしくお願いします。この番組は英語で、これから話しますので、YouTube の自動翻訳の機能がありますので、これを聞いている方が手元でその YouTube の自動翻訳の機能を使うと、この我々が話す英語が日本語の字幕が出るようになりますので、それをご覧ください。Firstly, I would like to ask you about the climate crisis recently. Last year was the highest temperature, so many people panic in the climate crisis.
Yeah.
How do you think about that?
So climate crisis is a made-up word. It's something that we don't use in any of the climate science. It's something that doesn't appear in the UN climate panel reports. It is literally just something to scare people with. Now, climate change or global warming is a real problem. And there are problems from higher temperatures. For instance, when temperatures go higher, you will see more people suffering from heat and possibly heat deaths. But you need to include the whole information because remember, as temperature goes up, you get more heat deaths. But as temperature go up, you also get fewer cold deaths. And almost everywhere on the planet, many more people die from cold than from heat. So over the last 20 years, as temperatures have risen, we actually know that it has led to another 168,000 additional heat deaths, but more than 300,000 fewer cold deaths. Overall, we see many fewer people die, not more people die.
Yeah.
Again, we just need to hear the whole information. So there is a problem, there is not a crisis, and that matters. Because if you think this is the end of the world, you're willing to spend everything on fixing this problem. But once you realize it's one problem of many problems in the world, you're going to say, show me a good solution that is fairly cheap, but delivers a lot of good. And that is the conversation that we're missing in climate.
有馬さんはどういう感じですか？
Yes, I agree with Bjorn completely. And I'm a bit, frustrated with the comments by Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations. He's saying that the earth is boiling, we are being burned, or something like that. And UN is a body who has published the SDGs, 17 SDGs. So Secretary General should pay equal attention to all the SDGs. But it sounds as if he is paying only attention to the climate mitigation by dramatizing the climate risk by very much hysterical wording such as climate crisis or we are battling for our lives or something like that. It is not accurate.
And of course, again, it leads to focus on just one thing. Remember, again, all of our societies face a lot of issues. If one issue takes up all the oxygen in the room, gets all the attention, it means that we're forgetting all the other issues. So again, you should go for the right description. It's a problem, but not the end of the world. And that really does matter because that means we can be smarter both on climate and on all the other issues.
And as you said, there is the cost and the benefit of the climate change. And in the tropical area, the climate change is very dangerous. But in Japan or Russia and Canada, such a in such a cold country, climate change not necessarily is not so dangerous.
Oh, absolutely. So I don't know about Japan, but very clearly, research shows that in Denmark, where I come from, most of Scandinavia, Russia, as you point out, Canada, they're so northerly and so cold that all other things equal, it's very likely that the benefits of increased temperatures will outweigh the costs, at least in the short and medium term. Now, this does not mean that we shouldn't do anything about climate, because the reason why we want to help is not predominantly to help rich Western people or rich Japanese. The reason is that a lot of the world's poorest people who live near the equator are going to be much more exposed to, for instance, higher heat waves, and they're going to have problems. They will need to shift their agriculture. They will have rising sea levels, which will also pose problems. So there's a real need to help poor people. But, and again, then we need to ask ourselves, all right, how do you best help poor people? Do you help them by cutting carbon emissions in Japan? Which will have no impact right now, which will have no impact in the next couple of decades, but will change the temperature in, say, 50 or 100 years a little bit. So do you help poor people by cutting temperatures slightly by the end of the century? Or do you help them right now with the problems they actually have? If you ask them, they much would prefer you to help them right now when their kids are dying, when they have all these problems, instead of helping them 100 years ineffectively. Again, this does not mean that we shouldn't consider climate change. It does not mean we shouldn't do smart stuff on climate change, but it means we need to stop thinking that climate is, if you will, the only knob that we should turn. If we want to make the world a better place, it's all about CO2. No, it's not. It's about figuring out which of the many things we can do that will do the most good.
I think there is two things to distinguish. One is, as you said, the hot area and the cold area, and another thing is the problem, damage of the climate change and cost to and the repair the damage. There very few people realize the cost to curb the damage of climate change, and they some mass media assumes climate policy by climate policy some company can make money. In Japan, Nikkei Shimbun is encouraging many ESG investment to make money.
And again, look, some companies are going to make a lot of money from climate policy. But fundamentally, if we don't want to do climate policy unless we're forced to, it probably means that we overall, for all of society, will become poor. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, we pay for a lot of other things that are good. We pay for education, we pay for military, we pay for, culture. There are lots of things we pay for, so that's fine. But we should ask, how much do we get for that money? And what I think you're also alluding to is, most people get the idea of saying, if you have stronger climate policy, you get less temperature rise over the century, and that means you get lower damages. That's great. That's the whole sort of standard argument on climate change. But what most people fail to think about is, the stronger climate policy you make, the costlier your climate policy becomes. There's a cost to climate, yes, but there's also a cost to climate change policy. Given that we have to pay both of them, we should be concerned about the sum of those two. Now, this is not original thinking from me. Unfortunately, a really smart guy called William Nordhaus has made this argument for now 30 years. He actually is the only climate economist to win the Nobel Prize in climate economics for this very point. There's cost to climate, but there's cost to climate policy as well. you need to look at both of these. And so what we typically talk about is we need to cut temperatures as much as we can to reduce the cost of climate. But that also makes the cost of climate policy escalate out of any proportion. And that's why we should probably do something, but not too much about climate. If we do too little, we actually leave off opportunities to make the world better. But if we do too much, we also leave off opportunities to do better in the world. We need to find that middle ground. And that's really hard in the climate conversation because it's such a polarized conversation where people say, it's the end of the world, or it's not happening at all. Well, actually, it is happening, but we need to be smart.
有馬さんもご存知のように日本の状況は2020年に菅首相がカーボンニュートラルということを、宣言して、Japan is going to realize carbon neutral until 2050, but we are uncertain about the cost. How much does it cost to carbon neutral to 2050? 有馬さんの方からちょっと。
Yes, of course, it is very much hard to calculate the actual cost for achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. But when he announced 2050 carbon neutrality goal, he said that climate policy or climate action should not be regarded as burden to the economy. But I think this is a very much misleading statement because it is apparent that if you take some actions for mitigate climate emissions, then that will inevitably entail cost. Otherwise, the countries would not have had such a difficult time for negotiating a climate deal because people know that it is entailing cost. And the international negotiation is somehow how to distribute the mitigation burden across the countries. So that is a reality. So I agree that we need to take an action for climate mitigation, but we need to squarely face the reality that climate action will take cost. Then how to minimize that cost or how to make those actions more efficiently, that is what we have to think. So arguing that climate action will automatically lead to green growth or something, that is something like we are fooling ourselves.
Yeah, it's a fairy tale. So look, as you rightly point out, if climate policy was incredibly good or actually would make us money, everyone would just be doing it. And we wouldn't need to have these negotiations every year where everybody sort of grudgingly promise a little bit. We would just all be going to a green nirvana. But we're not, because it actually has cost. Because switching from fossil fuels to renewables is actually costly. You need a lot of backup, you need a lot of changes in your infrastructure. It's not impossible, but it will be costly. So you asked, what is the cost of net zero? And it's kind of surprising that so few organizations have looked at what is the total cost, given that all governments, or at least all rich governments, have made this promise. But McKinsey has done one estimate of this, and they just measured the actual cost. So how much money do we have to pay in order to get to net zero? Their estimate was, for the world as a whole, this would cost about $5.6 trillion per year. That's a lot of money. That's sort of 5 or 6% of global GDP. But this is only the cost. But there's also a slowdown in growth. So it's more likely that this will perhaps cost in the order of, one estimate from a recent survey in climate change economics seems to indicate that this could cost in the order of $27 trillion per year, or across the century about 7% of global GDP every year for the rest of this century. That's more than what we spend on education. That's more than what we spend. That's pretty much on par with what we spend on healthcare. This is not going to be cheap. Now, it will have benefits because we will see lower cost from climate damages. So there are real benefits, but the benefits are probably only 1/7 of the cost.
Yeah.
Or to put it differently, for every dollar we were to spend, we would achieve about 17 cents of climate benefits. That's a bad deal. Spending 100 yen and only doing 17 yen worth of good, bad idea. It's not that this is not a real issue, but it is right now. We don't talk about the costs. We only talk about the benefits. And that misleads us into believing that, we should just be doing all of this stuff. But actually, this is going to be fantastically costly. And if I can just add one more thing, what a lot of politicians are starting to realize is that their electorates love it when they promise grand things, but they don't love it when the bill comes. And so what we're seeing increasingly is a lot of politicians are getting a little scared. Just a few days ago, Scotland announced that they were no longer going to do their 2030 promise, which was a cut by 75% by 2030, because that's just impossibly costly for Scotland to do. And so politicians are starting to say, well, maybe we didn't mean what we promised. And of course, that's not the way to do climate policy. And perhaps more importantly, if you start making too many demands on the voters, you're going to be poor. You're going to be less comfortable. You're going to be colder. You're going to be less happy about the way the world works. You're going to be booted out of office. And of course, that's the thing, what's happening. There's a lot of other issues with Trump. But we will end up getting Trumps or Bolsonaros or other kinds of people who will just simply say, screw the whole thing. I don't agree with that argument, but the inevitable outcome of putting too much cost on the electorate is that they're going to boot out the people who keep putting those costs on the electorate.
That's the most difficult part of this problem. And politicians and people don't realize the real cost of the climate policy. How should we cure the problem?
Yeah, very, very difficult, because politicians tend to make empty promises. And but voters could support that an ambitious climate action so long as that does not affect their monthly payment. But what is happening now in Japan and also in other countries, the ambitious climate actions are beginning to make an impact on their daily or monthly payment. So that is the case in Germany, that is the case in France. And also in Japan, while we are talking about decarbonization, government cannot still stop spending on subsidy for gasoline. And it is something like a minus carbon tax. So it is completely contrary to government action, government ambition to cut emissions. But all of these shows that the ordinary people are very much fed up with higher energy prices. So what is most important for many government is how to keep energy prices within affordable range. Otherwise, the voters or ordinary people will start to be very much frustrated or get angry against the climate actions, and that is in the end it is not beneficial for long term the endeavor for cutting emissions. As Bill said, we need to take actions for combating climate change, but that action needs to be sustainable politically, socially, and economically.
And it's not right now. So I think you're absolutely right. This is about realizing that once you start making very grand promises, that's going to be fantastically expensive. And in Germany and in England, for instance, politicians were playing around with the idea that they wanted to enforce everyone to have heat pumps. Now, heat pumps is a great idea. I mean, they're basically magic. They make more energy, or that's not actually true, but they make it seem like they can make energy out of nothing. It's just it's amazing innovation. And of course, eventually we should all shift to heat pumps. But Denmark produces a lot of them. But we should not do that before you need to remodel your house.
Yeah.
And what German and English politicians were essentially saying is, no, you'll have to spend in the equivalent of say $10,000 or $20,000 on getting a new heat pump. That would also often be less convenient than the one that you had in your house before. It was the oil heater or the gas heater. And not surprisingly, most people are like, I'm not going to pay. You know, if you start asking people to pay $10,000 or $20,000, they're going to vote you out of office. So I think it's about those very clear signs of where you start having to pay a lot of money. Likewise, a lot of governments were very eager to tell everyone, we got to switch over to electric cars. Now, electric cars are great for some things. And if you've ever driven a Tesla, it's a fun car to drive. But most people can't afford it. They often don't want it. If you don't live in a house, where are you going to charge your car? Those kinds of things. And of course, also, if you drive a lot, it's just, you know, if you live out in the countryside, it's not a very good car. It's good for some people somewhere, which is why we've had to make incredibly large subsidies, and we still can't get most people to buy these electric cars. So governments have promised to cut off the fossil fuel car by 2030 or 2035 or something. But now we're getting close to it. And when most people still want to buy a gasoline car, you're not going to get away with that as a government. And those are the real costs of making unreasonable climate promises. Again, we should do stuff, but we should do it smartly, and that's what we're not doing. We're somehow focused on saying, how can we cut a lot that's going to be fairly expensive in Japan, rather than realizing this is a problem about how can we get the whole world to cut. And remember, Japan is a tiny bit in that. Most of the rich world is actually a tiny bit in that. We used to emit most of the CO2, but now we're a small part of this. The rich world is about 1/3 of the emissions in the 21st century. Most of the emissions in the 21st century will come from China, India, and Africa. And so the real issue is, how can we get them on board? And of course, we're not going to do that by saying it's going to be incredibly expensive, because they don't want to spend money. They want to get out of poverty.
And maybe Denmark is the most advanced country in the carbon neutral policy, and carbon tax is very high, and gasoline tax is very high, and electricity bill is the highest in the world.
Yes, congratulations, right? and again, look, you can get few countries to do that. So England has constantly been heralded as this country that, you know, started the Industrial Revolution and has now dramatically reduced their carbon emissions. And everybody's like, oh, we should all be like England. But of course, the reason why they can, and why Denmark can, is because they're really small. And because, you know, if you want to be a little blunt, England is the banker for the world. Banking doesn't take very much CO2, but they're no longer producing any stuff. And of course, you can't have the whole world deindustrialized. You can have a few countries deindustrialized and maybe get away with it, but you can't have the whole world deindustrialized. Who's going to do the food? Who's going to do the, you know, the stuff that we all want? And so the reality is, we're in some ways pursuing a policy that is not only not going to work for the whole world, but that is not even going to be plausible or doable for Denmark or for the UK, because once you get just a little further down that road, it starts becoming very expensive, as the heat pumps showed for England.
有馬さんは交渉官としてね、こういう、気候変動の問題も20年ぐらいやってこられたと思うんですけど、そのヨーロッパっていうのがちょっと僕の目から見ると、なんかこう異常にこの問題に熱心に見えるのはあれはどういうことなんでしょうかね。
The reason why Europeans are always very much, I'd say, fanatical about climate change mitigation, there are a couple of reasons to my mind. First of all, I think when climate change emerged in the early 1990s, it was also the time of the European Union, EU unification, and compared with the US and Japan, EU wanted to show some moral high ground compared with other developed regions. And they have taken already some actions for climate mitigation. And also by setting a new rule in carbon counting and so on, most notably UK, they wanted to set a standard for a new world economic order. And also by nature, I think European people are very much concerned about the natural conservation and so on compared with the American people. You had a very strong tradition of green parties and green NGOs. And also, to my mind, European countries have been sending a lot of missionaries to all over the world in 16th and 17th century. And the eco-fundamentalism is something like a modern religion. And Europe wanted to, send missionaries, new type of missionaries to all over the world. So that is my interpretation why Europeans are very much, obsessed with climate mitigation. So, but I'm very much curious about the view from Bjorn, you are Europeans. How
Yes.
do you analyze?
Well, I first of all, I would probably bow to your analysis because it's very hard to analyze yourself, there's certainly a feeling of we want to be good, as in the best at being good. And climate is a very easy way to show virtue and show that you're just incredibly concerned and want to do good in the world. But again, we come back to this issue of realizing if you're actually doing climate policy to do good in the world, why are we not talking about all the other things we could also do to do good in the world? Why is cutting carbon the only way to help the world? Well, it's one way to help the world, but it's actually a fairly ineffective way. So, remember again, if all of the rich world cut its entire carbon emissions now, that is, if all of us went carbon neutral today, which would be a horrendous world in so many ways. I mean, we'd all be stuck here and we'd be cold and we'd be pretty hungry too very quickly. But if we did all that and stayed carbon neutral for the rest of the century, the impact on temperatures by the end of the century would be about half a degree lower.
Yeah.
So yes, something, but not a huge thing. Again, because most of the emissions are going to come from China, India, and Africa. And so this is not about what we do. This is about us telling everyone else what they should be doing. And that comes across as you point out, a little sort of missionary. We're telling everyone this is how you do good. But of course, for most people on this planet, it's about coming out of poverty. It's about stopping being hungry. It's about stopping getting diseased and die and have your kids die. These are the things that most people in the world worry about. And we know what drives most of that is economic growth, which to a very large extent has been driven and probably will be driven for at least a couple of decades more by fossil fuels. And that's why you see, China and India and elsewhere. I love the point that people will tell you solar and wind is cheaper than anything else. Well, yes, when the sun is shining and when the wind is blowing, but most people actually want power 24/7, which is why India last year, they got more solar power, absolutely, but they actually got 3 times more coal power.
Yeah.
Because they know that what really drives economic growth is a base load power, that is 24/7 power, which is typically fossil fuel driven. Now, you can sprinkle on a little bit of solar, and solar is sometimes really good, but it's not generally a good thing. So again, we need to recognize, and I think, I veered off a little bit from the Europeans. We like to believe that this is the only way to help the world.
Yeah,
and we're
also
wrong.
from the viewpoint of developing countries, they consider that developed countries have accumulated their national wealth by squandering a huge amount of fossil fuels up to now.
Well, not squandering, they actually use them. Yes.
And now developed countries are telling developing countries not to use fossil fuels.
Yes.
And they are discouraging the multilateral development bank like a World Bank or ADB or FDB. From financing fossil fuel related projects.
Yes.
So this sounds very much, the double standard.
Oh,
and
it's
hypocritical
totally double standard.
from the viewpoint of developing countries. So they are calling that kind of action as, say, eco-colonialism.
Yeah, and it is colonialism. It is us telling the world how they should run while we're deindustrializing and then basically sending all the production to China and India and Vietnam and wherever else we're doing it. But they're only going to be able to do all the production that we would like with fossil fuels.
In Japan, the renewable energy is in the controversy. And as Arno-san knows, the renewable energy is declining,
Mm.
and some people promoting it to the politicians, and the politicians make money by promoting renewable energy, and now renewable energy is a confusion in Japan. How do you estimate about the possibility of the renewable energy?
So we have this dream that somehow the whole world can get back to renewables. Remember, a couple of hundred years, we actually got almost all of our energy from renewables. In 1800, I estimate we got 94% of all energy from renewables. It was basically Great Britain, who was already in the throes of an industrial revolution with coal. They were really the only ones. The rest of us used wind turbines. Well, we called them windmills back then. A little bit of hydropower, and a lot of power from human work and from our mules and donkeys and horses and cows and whatever else you had. That was it. That was how we got our energy. For the last 200 years, we've gotten rid of most renewable energy because we have found a much, much better energy, which was fossil fuels, which could actually deliver power right where we were. Yeah. This was one of the big liberators of the world. Now, there are problems with fossil fuels. They create a lot of air pollution, which is probably the biggest environmental problem, and they also create global warming with CO2. So clearly, we should be mindful of that, and in the long run, we should probably stop using fossil fuels. But we cannot just move to renewables, because what are you going to do when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing? Yeah. And so what we've seen is a dramatic decline from about 94% down to about 13-14% of global energy coming from renewables over the last 50 years or so. This is mostly poor people using dung and cardboard or whatever they can find to keep warm and cook with. That was what we were at. Now, because of all our climate policies, we've slightly ramped up, so we're now at 16% globally at renewables. By 2050, when everybody is saying we're going to be net zero, the International Energy Agency estimate we will be at 33% renewable, and the Biden administration's Energy Information Administration estimate will be at 26%. So we're going to go up there. We're going to pay a lot of money for it, but there you are. But it's nowhere near the 100% that I think most people believe. We're actually, on current trends, somewhere between 1 and 2 centuries away from having that transition. And of course, again, what we fail to remember is that most of this is stuff we're going to pay for instead of course, fossil fuels, which is actually something that people want to pay for, which generates more benefits than the cost that you put in. So the reality is we're not seeing this grand transformation that people talk about. We're seeing a lot of political spending that moves the needle a little bit, but we're nowhere near what people think.
This is also the cost problem, and we can theoretically renewable energy 100% is maybe theoretically possible, but it's very, very expensive. And as the European situation proves, Germany's electricity bill is very climbing, and Germany's growth is declining. So the cost of the carbon neutrality is very high, and so, but very few people realize the economic cost of the climate policy.
Yes.
Yes, that's quite an important point. Because we need to realize the price tag for energy transformation, and as you said, energy transformation takes time. And Daniel Yagin, of course, you know him. And he's a very much famous energy economist. And one day he said the past energy transition took century for, say, transforming energy systems. And that energy transformation was driven by economy and also technical progress. But current argument about energy transition is completely driven by government intervention and so policies by regulation or subsidies. And they're aiming at complete energy transformation in just 20, 30 years, displacing the current energy systems. That is completely, how can I say, unrealistic.
Yeah.
So if you do so, then the cost will be astronomically high. And that will not be, again, politically and economically feasible. And that can never get support from people on the street.
Yeah.
So I think whatever we discuss about energy transition, we need to make a thorough cost estimate for that policies, and we should make it very much clear to the people so that we can understand the whole picture of the energy transition.
Yeah. Again, I would actually go even further. A lot of people, like Václav Smil, also one of the greats in the energy conversation, will say that we've actually never really had an energy transition. We just added more and more power. It's not that we stopped using wood when we started using coal. We kept on using wood, but then we just added on coal. And when we then got oil, we added on oil. And then we added on natural gas and nuclear power. And what we're doing with renewables is not actually replacing. We're a little bit replacing because there's a political push for it, but we're mostly just adding more energy on top. And that makes sense because energy is what powers everything we like about society. So people want more energy, not less energy. And so we really can't see that what you just described, namely that we want to switch off all of these other energy sources. So essentially all coal, all gas, all oil has to go. And then we'll only have renewables and nuclear power. That's going to be fantastically costly. What we need to recognize is that almost all global problems have never been solved by telling people, I'm sorry, would you mind being worse off? Would you mind being colder, less rich, more uncomfortable? Would that be okay with you? People don't respond very well to that argument. And what we have seen is we solve problems through innovation. So, if you think about back in the 1970s, a lot of people worried a lot about the fact that we couldn't feed everyone in the world. Now, the solution was not to tell everyone, I'm sorry, could you eat a little less and then we'll send it to the poor people in Africa? That was not the solution. The solution ended up being an innovation that made more high yield seeds that actually makes for every hectare or acre that you grow, you just produce a lot more food. That was how we made India, that was how we made Africa produce a lot more food. That's why we've gone from a world where almost 2/3 of everyone was starving to a world where less than 10% are starving now. We still need to fix the last 10%, and that's mostly about getting people out of poverty. But the fundamental point is innovation drives this. Imagine if we could innovate a new green technology that would be cheaper than fossil fuels. Everyone would switch. Now, it had to be good. One good example would be geothermal, which also runs 24/7. That has potential. We know that there's enough geothermal energy in the world to power the entire world many times over. We could do that. It's not cost effective right now, but imagine if we could make it cost effective. Everyone would switch and we'd have zero CO2 emissions. There's a lot of these potential breakthroughs. This is what Japan and everyone else should be investing in. And our research, so some of the work we've done with some of the world's best climate economists, showed that this is probably the very best long-term effective policy. Because if you pay a little bit of money for a lot of smart researchers, you can get an enormous benefit if just one of these many ideas turn out to be true. So the idea is, instead of, we're right now pursuing a policy that basically says, let's make it enormously costly for everyone, but let's try to get everybody on board. And of course, it's not going to work, and voters are going to boot you out. We need to spend less money, smarter, on climate innovation. That is energy innovation that drives CO2 down. That could be geothermal, it could be fourth generation nuclear, it could be solar with a lot of batteries or wind with a lot of batteries. I don't know what is going to win, but we should be spending a lot more resources on research and development into green energy sources. because that's much cheaper. We're estimating it would be about 20 times cheaper than what the world is currently spending on climate transition. And it would be much, much more effective. We estimate for every dollar spent, or for every yen spent, you would deliver $11 or 11 yens of benefits. That's a fantastic idea. That's what we should be doing first.
And the last problem I would like to discuss is the foreign assistance. As your recent books, you said, the priority of the foreign assistance in the menu, the climate change is the very low priority. So we should we should think of the priority of the global problem globally. So often we think about the global problem local in our country, but in advanced countries we can do very little thing. If we cure the problem globally, we should focus on the tropical areas or the foreign assistance, such kind of priority problem. How do you think?
Yes. So first of all, as we talked about in the beginning of this program, most of the reason why we care about climate change is not because of Japan or about Denmark, but it's about poor people in tropical countries, as you mentioned. Those are the people who will be hurt the most from climate change. But they're also the people who are hurt most by pretty much any other problem you can come up with. So they're very clearly hurt by lack of nutrition, lack of good food, lack of good education, lack of health care. There are lots of problems. And if you ask them, as you just mentioned, they absolutely want us to focus on that first. So when we're doing climate policy, because we want to do good for the world, we really have to ask ourselves, could we do better with the same amount of money? And the answer very, very clearly is yes, we could. So we worked together with more than 100 of the world's top economists and several Nobel laureates in trying to figure out where can you spend money and do the very most good. Yeah. We typically find that, the sort of standard climate policies, if you spend $1, you might do 17 cents of good, as we talked about with the net zero policies. So typical climate spending is actually a bad idea. But smart climate spending can possibly do, so if you get a smart carbon tax, even if you don't manage to get it entirely global, you can probably do, say, $2 worth of good for every dollar spent, which is a nice feedback. You spend $1, you do $2 worth of good. That's good. If you spend it, as I mentioned, on innovation, so spend it on green energy innovation to come up with smarter solutions for the future, every dollar will deliver $11. That's great. But if you actually want to do a lot of good, there's fantastic things you can do that can deliver tens of dollars back on the dollar, possibly even hundreds. So we have an outline of 12 amazing things that you could do for the world. So for instance, education, almost 500 million kids are functionally illiterate because they don't learn very much in their schools. We know that one of the best ways is to get them a tablet with educational software, get them in front of this tablet 1 hour a day. That tablet will teach them at their exact level. Now, the rest of the day will still be the same old thing. They will share the tablet with many others. And because they do that, their tablet is fairly cheap, so it'll cost about $31 per kid per year. But the benefit is that these kids learn what would normally have taken them 3 years to learn in school. We're speeding up their learning by 3 times. We simply make the whole world much more educated. This is one of the fantastic things you could do. We estimate this would cost about $10 billion a year, but it would generate benefits in order of more productive kids when they become adults in the order of $650 billion per year. This is why, that's $65 back in the dollar. It's 65 yen for each yen you spend. That's how you help the world. And then you focus on tuberculosis, you focus on malaria, you focus on maternal and newborn death, you focus on vaccinations, you focus on land tenure security. There's a lot of different things that you can do. What we find is if you do all of these things, it'll cost about $35 billion in total. So not nothing. Do you have 35 billion? I don't. Right. But you know, on a global level, this is nothing. This is literally pocket change, right? In the world's big scheme. $35 billion a year. It would save 4.2 million lives each and every year, and it would make the poor half of the world $1.1 trillion better off. We estimate on average that means every yen spent will deliver 52 yen's worth of good. So again, we're an advanced civilization. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can do several things. We should fix smartly some of these big climate problems, like for instance, invest a lot more in green energy R&D. But mostly, we should remember why it was we started down this path in the first place, because we wanted to do good in the world. What I just outlined is this $35 billion, one of the best ways to make good in the world ever.
Please make a last comment, Arima-san.
Yes, prioritization is very much important because we need to realize that in this uncertain geopolitical tension, the developed countries are spending more and more for defense budget and so on. So that will further crowd out the available resources for global agenda. And looking at the priority in developed and developing countries on various SDG goals, the developed countries tend to put very much high priority on climate action. But in developing countries, for example, China, say climate action is 15th out of 17 SDGs in terms of their priority. Indonesia, 9th out of 17. And in the poor nations, they put higher priority on zero poverty, zero hunger, decent education, healthcare or something. So that is a fact that the priority on various SDGs are different. And also we have a finite available financial resources. So we need to consider how to cleverly use the finite financial resources. So prioritization and cost effectiveness is quite important. So I very much buy your argument.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.